Hi, and welcome. I am Victor Gijsbers, and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video, I want to take a look at the article Two Dogmas of Empiricism, written by the American philosopher Willard van Orman Quine. Two Dogmas of Empiricism is a famous article. Indeed, it has often been said to be the most important or most influential article written in 20th century philosophy, or at least 20th century analytic or 20th century Anglophone philosophy. So what we want to do when we take a look at Two Dogmas of Empiricism is, of course, we want to understand what Quine is saying, but we also want to understand why it is so famous, why it had such an enormous influence, even though Quine himself, when he wrote it, thought of it as like definitely not his best work, as kind of hasty, kind of sketchy. Nevertheless, despite that, Two Dogmas of Empiricism was seen as a sea change in 20th century philosophy. Okay, so let's look at that. I want to start out by reading the first few sentences of the article because it gives us a very good overview of what Quine is going to do. Modern empiricism has been conditioned in large part by two dogmas. Now, when Quine talks about modern empiricism, I think he is talking about basically his own 20th century precursors. But we will say a bit more about that later. Modern empiricism has been conditioned in large part by two dogmas. One is a belief in some fundamental cleavage between truths which are analytic or grounded in meanings independently of matters of fact, and truths which are synthetic or grounded in fact. The other dogma is reductionism, the belief that each meaningful statement is equivalent to some logical construct upon terms which refer to immediate experience. Both dogmas, I shall argue, are ill-founded. One effect of abandoning them is, as we shall see, a blurring of the supposed boundary between speculative metaphysics and natural science. Another effect is a shift towards pragmatism. So what Quine does is he sets the context. The context is modern empiricism, and again, I'm going to come back to that. Then he tells us that he is going to attack two ideas. The first idea is this distinction between analytic and synthetic truths. The second idea is what he calls reductionism, and specifically it's the idea that every sentence, or at least every meaningful sentence, I suppose, that every meaningful sentence can be sort of reconstructed in terms of a pure observation language. So it can be reconstructed in terms that have only to do with things that we can observe and don't have anything to do with things that we can't observe, or that we could only sort of partially observe. So no sort of theoretical terms, which would be maybe things like electron or supernova, but I guess also even things like table maybe, right? When I say that there's a table here, then at least one way of understanding that sentence is to claim that it says something not about, like fundamentally it says something not about a physical object, but about certain observations that I could make, certain sense experiences that I could have. That's the kind of idea that is Quine's second dogma, the idea that any sentence can be translated into a sentence that talks only about direct observations. So that's what Quine is going to attack. And what is that going to lead to? It's going to lead to two things. It's going to lead to, first of all, something that Quine is going to call, not in this article, but that he is going to call at some point, naturalized epistemology. So the idea that philosophy is actually sort of much closer to the natural sciences, much more a part even of the natural sciences maybe, than we used to think, and a shift towards pragmatism, and we're going to look at that too. Okay, so I think the right way to proceed is to focus first on this analytic-synthetic distinction, because that's what most of the article is about, and that is mostly also what people think of when they think of Two Dogmas of Empiricism. When you ask people, well, what does Quine do in Two Dogmas of Empiricism? They say that he attacks, or even that he defeats, the analytic-synthetic distinction. So we're going to focus on the analytic-synthetic distinction, I first want to say something about what it is, and then I want to consider how you could attack a distinction. And then we're going to look in a little bit more detail at what Quine is doing and what sort of the overall shape of the article is. Because it is, in many ways, a very strange shape. It's a shape that actually doesn't fit the canonical idea of how to write good analytic philosophy very well at all. Okay, so what are analytic and synthetic statements? Well, here Quine is in a little bit of a bind because he needs to explain to us, like briefly, what analytic and synthetic are supposed to mean, even though he's going to attack this distinction and sort of ask us to reject it later on. Well, roughly speaking, we could think of something like this, right? An analytic statement is true just because of the meaning of the terms, and a synthetic statement is true because of the way the world is, right? So not just because of the meaning of the terms. That is sort of the rough, first sketch of what this distinction is supposed to be. Now, Quine then brings in Kant. And he tells us that, Kant gives a definition in terms of containment, and he says, well, that's not really helpful. That only works for a very particular kind of statement. But Kant's intent can be restated thus, right? I'm in the beginning of section 1 now. Kant's intent can be restated thus. A statement is analytic when it is true by virtue of meanings and independently of fact. Okay, that's basically what I just said. I want to emphasize at this point that Quine's encounter with Kant here is not really, in any sense, a serious encounter with Kant. And actually, I think that Quine would agree. I think that Quine would agree that he hasn't really done the work on Kant. And I think we can, and that he doesn't even really desire to do the work on Kant. And I think we can see that from three things, which all of which are actually kind of important to point out. So I want to take a little bit of time explaining why Quine and Kant aren't really sort of talking to each other here, not in order to tell you that Quine should have read Kant better or something like that, but because it illuminates what Quine is doing and what Quine isn't doing. It illuminates the background. So here's the first sign that Quine isn't really talking to Kant in this article. It's the title, Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Now, whatever Kant is definitely not an empiricist, right? So immediately we can sort of see that the philosophers that Quine has in mind, well, Kant is not really going to be one of them. Okay, here's the second sign, very important for understanding the Quine's article. Kant famously introduces the distinction between analytic and synthetic to give an extra and independent dimension to a discussion that already has the terms a priori and a posteriori. Right? So already people are talking about the a priori and the a posteriori, that which I can know independently of experience and that which I can only know based on experience, or justify independently of experience and justify based on experience. And Kant adds the analytic-synthetic distinction in order to create sort of four possibilities and thereby create the possibility to talk about the synthetic a priori. So claims that we can know independently of experience, but that do have real content, that are not just about meanings, that don't follow from the principle of non-contradiction, as Kant might tell us. This is absolutely crucial for understanding Kant. It is not in the Quine article, right? Quine does not make a distinction between, on the one hand, the a priori and the a posteriori, and on the other hand, the analytic and the synthetic, right? For Quine, to be analytic is to be knowable independently of experience, and to be synthetic is to be true, well, it depends on fact, right? A synthetic statement is something that depends on the facts, and of course the facts are things that we can only find out through experience. That's not what Kant would say at all, right? I mean, for Kant, the most important synthetic truths, the synthetic a priori truths, can be known independently of experience. They're not based on any facts in any sort of normal sense of the word fact at the very least. So this is something to keep in mind. For Quine, analytic-synthetic is basically the same as a priori, a posteriori, and it's also basically the same as necessary and contingent. Right? All of those distinctions sort of run together in the way that Quine is thinking here. And of course that has to do with the fact that the philosophers that he has in mind, the empiricists that he's talking about, and that will be people like the logical positivists, people like Carnap, that they agree that there is no such thing as the synthetic a priori. Okay, so that's important. Third thing that I want to say about Kant and Quine is that Kant actually doesn't say the kinds of things that Quine makes him say here. Right? Kant conceived of an analytic statement as one that blah, 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 blah. Kant thinks that a statement is analytic when blah, 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 blah. Kant isn't talking about statements. When Kant introduces the analytic-synthetic distinction, he talks about analytic and synthetic judgments. Right? And a statement, that's some kind of verbal utterance, or maybe it's a sentence. A judgment, the most reasonable way maybe to think of that is to think of it as some kind of mental act. Right? So it's not really the same thing. And I think this is important. And I think this is important. I want to say a little bit about why I think it is important. So Quine is going to end up saying, at the very end of the article, that we can believe the truth, or sort of keep affirming the truth of any claim we want, provided that we are willing to make changes in our beliefs elsewhere. So Quine is going to end up, and that is sort of one of the pragmatist elements, I guess, he's going to wind up saying that, based on what works for us, we have a choice in which statements we want to sort of make immune to criticism and which we want to be open to criticism by experience. So there's a sort of choice, in a sense, about what are the analytic statements and what are the synthetic statements. And Kant doesn't think that at all. And so it might seem that Kant and Quine are sort of in conflict, right? Fundamentally in conflict. But let's think about this example. Here is Kant, and Kant says that it is a synthetic a priori truth that all events have causes, right? And the a priori part is not so important for us now. It's synthetic, right? All events have a cause. That's a synthetic claim according to Kant. So it doesn't follow from the meaning of the terms alone. And Kant emphasizes that it's not part of the meaning of the term event that it is caused. Okay, and so it's a synthetic statement, and so if it's true, I can't see that from the concepts alone, I've got to sort of show it. And Kant goes to great lengths to show it. Now, here is what a Quinean might say. A Quinean might say, no, Kant, that's not the way this works. I mean, you can also take this to be an analytic statement. Or at least you can take this to be a statement that is immune, that you can just hold on to without having to do any kind of investigation. Basically, by making it sort of the definition of an event. Right? I can always hold on to the claim that all events are caused, even if, let's say in experience, I find a lot of things that are not caused, if I'm willing to say, well, then those are not events, right? They're something else, they're happenings. So I can always do that, right? It's always possible to keep a hold of any claim and allow any kind of experience to come in as long as you are willing to make changes elsewhere. So there is a sense in which the Quinean could say, well, all events have a cause, that could be something that is, just true in a sense by virtue of meaning, in the sense that we can choose to keep it true no matter what happens, or we can also choose to sort of make it respondent to new evidence. Now, why do I bring in this example? Because I think it illustrates the difference between a statement and a judgment. Right? I mean, yes, you can keep the same statement, the statement all events have a cause, and either treat it as immune to revision or as not immune to revision. But it's not immediately clear that in those two scenarios, you are using the statement to express the same judgment. Right? If I say something like, all events have a cause, that's true because that's my definition of event. Well, then when I'm claiming that all events have a cause, I'm probably making a different judgment than the judgment I'm making when I say all events have a cause, and not treating that as a merely sort of verbal truth. Okay, so there are some complications here, and I think we need to keep this in mind. I mean, Quine is a philosopher who is beyond the linguistic turn, so to speak. I mean, he is conceiving of all of this in deeply linguistic terms, and Kant doesn't. And so one of the things that one would have to wonder is whether thinking about the relation between statements and beliefs, or statements and judgments, is going to sort of change the way that we approach Quine's story. Now, Quine doesn't think so. For Quine, the linguistic items are sort of the fundamental thing. We don't have a hold of our things like beliefs unless we tie them to verbal behavior and statements in some way. But we don't have to agree with that. All right. Okay, so what is Quine going to do? Quine is going to attack this analytic-synthetic distinction. Now, what I would like to do is I would like to walk you through a couple of ways in which you could attack a distinction and then ask what Quine is actually doing. Okay, so I have a couple of examples of ways in which you can attack a distinction, because this can mean so many things. So here's one thing. Suppose that somebody says, there are two kinds of books, good books and bad books. Well, that's a distinction that you could attack by saying, no, look, there's a whole spectrum between good and bad. There are also kind of okay books and so-so books and slightly bad books. And so you are making this sort of false claim because there's nothing sort of fundamentally wrong with the distinction as long as we keep in mind that there's a whole spectrum between the good and the bad. Right? That's one way to attack a distinction, to point out that there's a spectrum and that people have been ignoring that. Here's a second way of attacking a distinction. You could say that actually there's just a false dichotomy. So if somebody says, you are either for us or against us, then I might say, no, I'm not for you and I'm not against you. I just don't care about you at all. Right? That seems possible. So that would be to convict the distinction of being a false dichotomy. A third term, or maybe more terms, need to be added. Okay. Now, both of these two ways of attacking a distinction actually just keep the distinction. They accept it, but they add more stuff. Here's a third way, maybe, to attack a distinction. It is to say that it's, in a sense, arbitrary how things are classified according to the distinction. So suppose that we take the distinction between the fashionable and the unfashionable. I mean, that's a real distinction. Some things are fashionable, like my clothes are super fashionable. So it's a real distinction, but of course it's also kind of arbitrary. In 10 years' time, people will say, whoa, what was that Gijsber's guy wearing? That's a way to attack a distinction, to say that it's sort of arbitrary and thereby maybe of little use for philosophy. Could do that, something like that. We could also say that, we can attack a distinction by suggesting that we can never really use it because we are unable to classify things. We don't have the right knowledge. So a skeptic attacks the distinction between true statements and false statements on precisely that grounds. Right? A skeptic will say that we don't know which of the statements are the true ones and which are the false ones. And that makes us sort of unable to apply this distinction. That is already a little bit more fundamental, right? I mean, to say that there's a spectrum or that a third or fourth term needs to be added, that keeps the distinction firmly in place. To say that it is either, just sort of contingent and therefore not much use, or that we can't actually apply it because we don't have the right knowledge or the right skills, that sort of suggests that maybe we're better off without using it. That's more fundamental. Finally, I would like to look at two ways of attacking a distinction that would sort of destroy it, if that's the right word to use. You could, for instance, say that the classes distinguished by the distinction don't even exist. So if somebody says there are two kinds of people, there are the saved and the damned, well, if I don't believe in an afterlife, then I'm going to say, no, there are no saved and there are no damned, right? I mean, this distinction is, it doesn't apply because the distinction doesn't actually exist in reality. That's a very fundamental way of trying to get rid of a distinction. Or I could say that although, I understand the terms and they do apply, there's actually no distinction because it's the same thing. So if somebody says it's very important to make a distinction between, on the one hand, racists and on the other hand, ethno-nationalists, then I might be tempted to say that no, it's not important to make a distinction between racists and ethno-nationalists, because ethno-nationalist is just a nice word for racist, right? I mean, there's no real distinction there. Okay, so we have seen 6 ways of trying to attack a distinction. 2 of them that sort of accept it but want to add more stuff. 2 of them that say that we can't actually use it, it's useless. And 2 of them that say that either there is no distinction because of the way that reality is, or there is no distinction because these terms kind of mean the same thing, and so it's totally inapplicable to our description of reality. What is Quine going to do with the analytic-synthetic distinction? Well, he is going to end up doing something that's a little bit like saying that it's useless or that we can't apply it, and a little bit like saying that it doesn't apply, that there are no such things. And I think he sort of wavers between those options a little bit. Right, so at some points, Quine seems to be saying that he doesn't really know how to apply it. That, for instance, he doesn't know whether all green things are extended, whether that is a synthetic or an analytic statement. And so he seems to suggest that we don't really know how to apply it, that maybe there's something useless about it, because of our skill maybe in applying it. At other points, though, Quine seems to suggest that it actually, there's nothing in reality, when we look at statements, there's nothing about statements that cuts them up into analytic and synthetic. And I think maybe that more radical reading is the better reading, right? That what Quine wants to end up saying is that, objectively speaking, there is no distinction between the statements of a language, such that some of them are the analytic statements and some of them are the synthetic statements, right? We just thought there was, but there isn't. Okay, so that is what Quine in the end wants to say, right? He wants to say something like, that distinction that you thought there was between the analytic and the synthetic statements, if you think about it, it's not really there, right? It's not really there. How does Quine argue for that? And now I'm coming to the point where I want to talk about the structure of the article. How is Quine going to argue for that? Well, maybe somewhat surprisingly, sections 1, 2, 3, and 4 are Quine trying to elucidate the distinction between analytic and synthetic statements by tying it to other concepts, to other distinctions, maybe, or tying it to synonymy, tying it to definition, tying it to interchangeability and truth. So Quine is going to try to sort of elucidate the analytic-synthetic distinction. Well, trying to elucidate something and then maybe failing, because that is what's going to happen. Quine is going to fail. At least he's going to tell us that, all the terms that if he uses them, all the terms that allow him to make the analytic-synthetic distinction are in just as much need of clarification as the analytic-synthetic distinction itself. Trying to do that kind of analysis, and even failing that kind of analysis, is something that is very familiar to philosophers. Right? In fact, it is something that philosophers do all the time. Right? I try to make the distinction between good and bad actions. That is what ethicists and meta-ethicists, I guess, try to do all the time. Right? And they tend to fail. Trying to make the distinction between the causal relations and the non-causal relations. That's what people who create theories of causation try to do. And they tend to fail, right? There tend to be these counter arguments, these cases that don't fit the theory. Or they tend to come up with theories that use the same kinds of terms that they were starting from. So in order to explain the difference between good and bad actions, I'm going to explain good and bad in terms of other ethical vocabulary. That's also kind of common. So suppose that this is what a philosopher does. A philosopher tries to explain a particular concept or pair of concepts, and preferably in a sort of reductionist way, right? Without staying within the same circle of concepts. So I want to try to explain analytic and synthetic without ending up talking about meanings and synonymy and necessity and, all the kinds of concepts that Quine thinks are in just as much need of clarification. So suppose I try to do that, and suppose that I fail. What then? Well, nothing, right? Try again. Let somebody else try again. It is not very common for a philosopher to end up saying, oh, well, if I fail at clarifying this distinction in a sort of reductive way in totally different kinds of terms, then it doesn't exist. Right? You never do that. You would do one of two things normally. Either you have some reason to believe that a reductive analysis must be possible, and then you keep trying. Or you have some reason to believe, maybe the failure itself is the reason to believe that a reductive analysis is not possible. And so you say, well, there's something primitive about the idea of, who knows, the idea of meaning, or the idea of synonymy, or the idea of analyticity itself, or the idea of necessity, right? I'm going to take one of these as one of my primitive terms. And that seems kind of okay, right? There's nothing in a failed attempt to give a reductive analysis of a concept that would imply that the concept has no content or can't be applied or anything like that. So how could anything that Quine does in sections 1, 2, 3, and 4 of this paper lead up to the conclusion that the analytic-synthetic distinction doesn't match a real distinction among the statements? Well, my answer to that is that it leads up to it only in a sort of rhetorical way. 1, 2, 3, and 4 do not, I would say, even conceivably form an argument for what happens at the end of the article in section 6. Rather, 1, 2, 3, and 4 sort of create the psychological state in which we are extra interested and extra open towards the new ideas that Quine is going to present to us in section 6. I believe it was Pascal who said somewhere that if you want to convert a man to Christianity, you first have to make him unhappy. Because if you're happy, you have no interest in being saved, and so you have no interest in listening to this person who is telling you about Christianity. Something like that is happening in Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Right? 1, 2, 3, and 4, and maybe 5, are Quine trying to make us unhappy. And then 6 is Quine's own original vision, which, we are, much more interested in and much more likely to embrace if we are unhappy. So how does making us unhappy work? Well, making us unhappy works in such a way that Quine is going to point out to us that although we might have thought that it's not so hard to give an analysis of analytic and synthetic, of the analytic-synthetic distinction, actually it is hard to do this in a non-circular way. Right? Maybe we can only do this in a non-circular way. Again, that's not terrible. But suppose that you are already a little bit worried about all of these terms. You are already a little bit worried about meanings. And you are already a little bit worried about intentional languages. And I'm going to say a bit more about what that is later on. A little bit worried about terms like necessarily. And you are going to be a bit worried about all of those things if you are a contemporary empiricist. Well then, seeing that all these terms sort of hang together in such a way that you can't really get out of the circle, makes you feel a little bit worried about it all. And then when Quine in section 6 comes with his own vision, like this web of belief and this pragmatism, you might think, ooh, that is actually maybe a better way of thinking about this. And you've been convinced not so much by an argument that shows that the analytic-synthetic distinction is wrong, and therefore we have to think about it in this way, but sort of, you've been reading several pages of the kind of mood music that plays on your pre-existing anxieties and puts you in the mood for a radical new vision, which Quine then supplies at the end. So I would say that is roughly the structure of the argument. And there's something kind of funny or ironic about that, because usually people working in analytic philosophy would say that analytic philosophy works by argumentation, right? You have the premises and you get to the conclusion, and it's the rational argumentation that does all the work. In Two Dogmas of Empiricism, it doesn't seem to be the rational argumentation that does the work. It seems to be the mood music and then the metaphors and the vision at the end. When Quine has his web of belief, that is what does the work. That would be actually pretty germane to a philosopher like Richard Rorty, who says that all the great philosophers introduce new metaphors. But there Rorty is precisely kind of not conforming to the self-image of analytic philosophy. So I think there's something deliciously ironic about the fact that Two Dogmas of Empiricism has this very non-argumentative structure. Like fundamentally it has a very non-argumentative structure. And that is ironic because it is seen as the greatest example, maybe even, of a form of philosophy that claims to be based on argumentation. Okay, so having said all of that, let us look a little bit more at what Quine is doing in these first sections. And I'll get back, by the way, to the question of why all of this is important. Right? It's not just a new vision, but it's also supposed to be important. I'll get back to that a little bit later on. Okay, so what is happening in these first sections? Well, basically Quine is going to say, okay, I don't really understand analyticity. What is it? Let's try to define it in other terms. Let's try to understand it in terms of synonymy. There's actually something interesting going on there, right? Quine has this distinction between sentence 1 and 2. No unmarried man is married, and no bachelor is married. And both of those are supposed to be analytic. And Quine actually accepts that number 1 is true by virtue of the meaning of the terms. Right? So he actually accepts here, he seems to accept at least, that sort of this logical vocabulary is pretty unproblematic. So at least some analytic statements are unproblematic. And then he's going to focus on the problematic ones, the number 2. I mean, that's not bad, right? I mean, if the idea of analyticity has any use, then it should be a different idea from the idea of being a logical tautology. So we get through synonymy, we get through definition, and basically, again and again, Quine is going to say that either you have to presuppose analyticity in the definition, or you end up with a term that is just as obscure as analyticity is. The one that maybe requires some explanation on my part is what happens in section 3, when Quine talks about interchangeability salva veritate. So the idea would be that you could maybe define analyticity in terms of truth. Right? You could make the distinction between analytic and synthetic statements once you have in place the distinction between true and false statements. And surely Quine doesn't want to be skeptical about true and false statements, right? He doesn't want to get rid of that distinction. No, he doesn't want to get rid of that distinction. So how can you base analyticity on truth and falsehood? Well, Quine says, maybe it's like this. If I have a phrase A and a phrase B, and I can always put phrase A in place of phrase B, and whatever sentence I do that in will remain true if it was true, or it will remain false if it was false, then these two phrases mean the same thing, right? And that's what I need to explain analyticity, sameness of meaning. So here's an example. Take Quine and take the author of Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Those are the same person, right? So we might expect that we can always put Quine and the author of Two Dogmas of Empiricism in the same sentences, right? We can always replace one with the other. I am talking about Quine. That's true. I am talking about the author of Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Well, that's also true, right? Sure. And so the idea is, if you can always do this for every sentence, and the truth or falsity of the sentence will always remain the same, then those two phrases mean the same thing. And now Quine is going to ask us whether this is good enough, right? If we can always interchange two terms, salva veritate, right, saving truth, without making a difference in truth, does that mean that they have the same meaning? Does that mean that, they can ground analytic sentences? And Quine says yes. And this is where we find these sentences 3, 4, and 5 in the text. Quine says, well, yes. I mean, take a sentence like, necessarily all and only bachelors are bachelors. If I can, that's true, right? If without a change in truth value, I can put unmarried men in place of bachelors, so I get necessarily all and only bachelors are unmarried men. If we can exchange these two terms without changing truth value, then this is true too. And if this is true, if it's true that necessarily all and only bachelors are unmarried men, then all and only bachelors are unmarried men is a necessary statement, and therefore, again, Quine thinks that necessity, analyticity, and a prioricity are the same thing, and therefore all and only bachelors are unmarried men is analytic. So we can actually get to analytic truths if we have interchangeability salva veritate. And then Quine says that this is hocus pocus. Why is it hocus pocus? Well, in order to understand why Quine thinks this is hocus pocus, we have to make the distinction that he makes between an extensional language and an intentional language. So an extensional language is a language that does not have any phrases or terms or concepts that allow us to make a difference between two concepts that apply to the same actual things. So take Quine and take the author of Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Those apply to the same thing. In a purely extensional language, there would be no sentence in which you exchange one of them for the other and, get from a truth to a falsehood or from a falsehood to a truth. Two terms with the same extension can always be replaced with one another in an extensional language without changing truth value. In an intentional language, that's not true. In an intentional language, in a language that, for instance, can talk about necessities, that would make it intentional. In an intent or meanings, that would also make it intentional. Or analyticity, that would always also make it intentional. In a language that can speak about any of those things, the fact that two terms have the same extension, that they apply to the same thing, the same object, doesn't necessarily mean that you can always interchange them. So here's an example. Barack Obama and the first black president of the United States, in fact, apply to the same person. And so in an extensional language, I could always change one for the other. But in an intentional language, that's not true. if I were to say Barack Obama means the first black president of the United States, that's a very strange statement. Even though the first black president of the United States means the first black president of the United States, seems, pretty okay. Or what about this? Barack Obama could also not have become the first black president of the United States. Could, right? We're talking about possibilities and necessities. Barack Obama could not have become the first black president of the United States. Maybe he, thought about running for president and then he thought, no, never mind. Okay. In that sentence, you can't really change Barack Obama with the first black president of the United States. Because the first black president of the United States could also not have become the first black president of the United States. Sounds a bit dubious. That sounds a bit dubious. Now, and in fact, this example, there are different ways of thinking about such sentences, but this example becomes much, much clearer when we think not about like singular terms, but when we think about general terms. So an example that Quine uses, I can't remember whether he uses it here or somewhere else. Oh yeah, he uses it here. Is creature with a heart and creature with kidneys. Right? Suppose that it's true that all the animals in the world that have a heart also have kidneys, and the animals that have kidneys also have a heart. Right? Suppose that that's true. Then those two concepts have the same extension. But of course, it's not true that we can change them in an intentional language in every sentence and have the truth value remain the same. Because it's true that it's possible that a creature with a heart is not a creature with kidneys. That's true. It's possible that a creature with a heart is not a creature with kidneys. That's true. What about it's possible that a creature with a heart is not a creature with a heart? That's not true. So in an intentional language, we cannot change terms that have the same extension but a different intention. Okay, what do we learn from this? What we learn from this is that basing analyticity on truth is only possible if we have an intentional language. Because we need sameness of meaning. And we only get sameness of meaning in this intentional language. So, basing analyticity on truth only works in an intentional language. But to talk about true and false statements in an intentional language, to believe that there is a distinction between true and false statements in an intentional language, is to believe that there is a distinction between analytic and synthetic statements. Because for something like necessarily A to be true, A has to be analytic. So truth in an intentional language already presupposes that the analytic-synthetic distinction can be applied. And so it can't be used to sort of ground it or reductively analyze it. Alright, so that is what I wanted to say about section 3, and roughly that is all I want to say about the first 4 sections of the paper. Section 5 introduces a new idea. It introduces the verification theory and reductionism. So Quine basically says that the analytic-synthetic distinction seems to make a lot of sense if you hold the idea that there are, that in any sentence really can be, for any sentence you can say which observations are the ones that would make it true and which are the ones that will make it false. Right? If you can do that for any sentence, well, any sentence where you have something to say is a synthetic sentence. And any sentence where you end up saying, well, actually it doesn't matter what the observations are, it's true anyway, or it doesn't matter what the observations are, it's false anyway, any sentence like that is going to be an analytic sentence. So the kind of reductionism that Quine talks about implies the analytic-synthetic distinction. And Quine thinks that it is equally hopeless, and for more or less the same reasons. The dogma of reductionism survives in the supposition that each statement, taken in isolation from its fellows, can admit of confirmation or information at all. My counter-suggestion is that our statements about the external world face the tribunal of sense experience, not individually, but only as a corporate body. What Quine is going to do here is he's going to make a counter-suggestion. The counter-suggestion is that statements do not face the tribunal of sense experience individually, but only as a corporate body. And this is then going to be sort of worked out in the metaphor of section 6. What is Quine doing, and what is he reacting against? Well, really, this is the crux, right? This is where we find out why Two Dogmas of Empiricism could be seen as such an important paper. Analytic philosophy at the time of Quine comes from people like Russell, Wittgenstein, but especially the Vienna Circle, the logical positivists, people like Carnap, who start out by making this distinction between statements that are, based in sense experience and therefore statements of the sciences, and statements that are not based on sense experience. Statements that are true or false independently of sense experience, and those are supposed to be the analytic statements. And since philosophy is not, in the business of science, philosophy is supposedly, at least this is what some of the people working in this tradition think, philosophy is supposedly in the business of analyzing sentences, right? Of taking the analytic sentences, analyzing, them, really analyzing concepts and thereby arriving at analytic truths about those concepts and thereby clarifying the structure of our language, right? That is what philosophy is supposed to be doing. We take concepts, we analyze them, that is, we set out analytic truths involving those concepts. They're analytic truths, that's why we don't need a laboratory. And then, once we have done that, we show it to people and we have clarified our language. That's nice. That kind of vision of philosophy obviously requires a distinction between the analytic and the synthetic. So what Quine is doing here is he's going to give us a counter vision that immediately impacts the self-description of philosophy. It immediately impacts how we can think about philosophy, about what philosophy is, about what the domain of philosophy is. If there is no analytic-synthetic distinction, then there is no special domain for philosophy. There are lots of complications here, and one complication that I want to briefly mention is that at least many of the early adherents of the analytic, or I should maybe say the positivist tradition, many of the early adherents would actually say that philosophy doesn't make any statements at all, that it's a kind of activity. But I'm going to leave that aside. I hope that it's clear why the analytic-synthetic distinction, the idea that some truths can be found from the armchair and other truths can only be found by doing science, is going to be absolutely crucial to the self-image of a philosophy that is supposedly an armchair discipline. If the analytic-synthetic distinction doesn't exist, then we have to rethink what philosophy is and rethink what its relation to natural science is. And that's what Quine is going to do, and that's what Quine is setting into motion here. And that is why Two Dogmas of Empiricism could become such a famous and influential article, because it cuts at the heart of a self-image of philosophy. Now, to briefly return to Kant, Kant, of course, thought that philosophy was in the business of finding not analytic statements, but synthetic a priori statements. And so, part of the dichotomy, like the way that Quine sets this up, right? Either you're doing analysis, or you are doing something empirical, is something that requires us to see the analytic-synthetic distinction and the a priori, a posteriori distinction as the same thing, right? So that's always in the background here. But again, that is something that all these early analytic philosophers agree about. So, what do we end up? What is the counter-suggestion? Well, the counter-suggestion is that statements face the tribunal of sense experience as a corporate body. This is sort of the Duham-Quine thesis, it has become known. Here is the beginning of section 6. The totality of our so-called knowledge or beliefs, from the most casual matters of Greek geography and history to the profoundest laws of atomic physics and even of pure mathematics and logic, is a man-made fabric which impinges on experience only along the edges. Or to change the figure, total science is like a field of force whose boundary conditions are experience. So the basic idea is that if I find something in reality, in observation, that doesn't fit my beliefs, which of my beliefs is false? That is a wrong question according to Quine. Right? That is the question that can only be asked if you embrace reductionism. What we should ask is, what changes, plural, could I make in order to make my beliefs consistent with the observations again? Well, there's always multiple options. Here's a very trivial example. Suppose that I believe that there is an elephant behind me. I now had a recalcitrant experience. I didn't see an elephant. What can I do? Well, of course I can give up the belief that there's an elephant behind me, but I could also give up the belief that my eyes are working correctly. Or I could adopt the belief that this elephant behind me has cunningly disguised himself as a bunch of bookshelves containing philosophy books. You know, that's possible. Now that's kind of a toy example, but in real life situations, you very often have very real choices. Right? What's going on? One person said to me that he, let's say, cleaned my house. I come into the house and it's completely dirty. What went on? Right? Maybe this person lied, or somebody came into my house and dirtied it after he cleaned it up. Right? One of those two things. Maybe even more possibilities. Those are very real choices, very real things that we have to deal with. And so, according to Quine, and this, of course, goes a step further than anything we've just said, any statement can be held true come what may if we make drastic enough adjustments elsewhere in the system. But if I really want to believe some truth, I can do it by making wild adjustments elsewhere. I think maybe the best example of that would be conspiracy theorists. Right? A conspiracy theorist really wants to believe something, really wants to believe that the earth is flat. Let's say that, a flat earth theorist really wants to believe that the earth is flat. Now you find all kinds of evidence that don't fit this idea, and so you change your beliefs. Right? Okay, all those scientists say that the earth is round. Well, they're being paid off by large corporations. The shadow of the earth on the moon is always circular. Well, that's because, you can think of some wild theory to adopt that is going to allow you to keep your idea that the earth is flat. Doesn't sound very rational. How could any of those choices be rational? Well, says Quine, basically it is you don't want to change too much about your beliefs. Right? You don't want to change too much about your beliefs, and you want to keep sort of your core beliefs intact. It's a pragmatic choice. It's a choice about, finding the theories that make the easiest sense with the least changes, and so on and so forth. I don't know. I don't know whether that's really an intelligible criterion, but okay, that's the criterion that Quine gives us. Each man is given a scientific heritage plus a continuing barrage of sensory stimulation, and the considerations which guide him in warping his scientific heritage to fit his continuing sensory promptings are, where rational, pragmatic. So this is a completely new way of thinking, and it's a way of thinking that seems to obliterate the distinction between science and philosophy. Right? You can't say science is empirical, philosophy is not empirical, because there is no distinction between the empirical and the non-empirical. That's always a pragmatic choice. And so whatever I'm going to do as a philosopher, it's going to be the same kind of thing, maybe in a slightly different way, as what the natural scientist is engaged in. So ontological questions are on a par with questions of natural science, and we're already well on the way towards Quine's naturalized philosophy. Final thing I want to say about this is that Quine's metaphor of the web of belief is none too precise. Right? If you really start thinking about that, it doesn't even make much sense. Why are some statements more on the edge and others more at the core? Well, they're supposed to have something to do with whether they could be shown false by experience, but how does experience even get into it? Right? Is experience sentence shaped? Probably not. So how don't we need some sentences that tie immediately to experience? Quine doesn't say anything about that. Here's maybe a more fundamental worry. Quine tells us that even the laws of logic are just elements of this web of belief which can be changed if that's useful. But then what are the strands between the elements of the web? Right? What makes it the case that the web is coherent or incoherent? Right? What makes it the case that if I believe A and I believe not A, that then there is a tension, a problem in my web of belief? Well, that's surely the laws of logic. But if they themselves are merely further elements in the web, then they seem to play a sort of impossible dual role in the metaphor, being elements that can be changed and being the standards that we use to judge whether the web is coherent or not. So that, I don't know. I mean, again, Quine doesn't say much about that. Now, I don't think that we need to criticize Quine for that too harshly here, because he's merely offering us a metaphor, and it's sort of a promise that maybe in his later philosophy he's going to do more. He's going to tell us more. He's going to work this out. And he is going to work this out. Okay, but it's good to be aware of that, this web metaphor by itself maybe generates a lot more questions than it answers. All right. So I've tried to tell you why people think that this is such an important paper, how it could have a big impact on the history of 20th century philosophy, its strange non-argumentative nature, the historical background against which it makes sense, and some of these sort of promissory notes that Quine is singing at the end of this paper. Does Quine defeat the analytic-synthetic distinction? Well, I would say in no way, right? You already need to have Quine's empiricist's anxieties in order to be very impressed with anything that goes on in sections 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you think that talking about meanings and necessity and so on is perfectly all right and perfectly intelligible, there's nothing in this paper that is going to suggest you that you're wrong. Right? There's nothing in this paper that's going to suggest you that there's anything problematic about analytic and synthetic statements. So I think that is also good to keep in mind. So it's important, certainly from the point of view of the self-image of philosophy. This is an important paper, had a lot of influence. I wouldn't say that it's a paper that shows us that the analytic-synthetic distinction doesn't exist, because it only shows that to people in a very, very specific philosophical state of mind. Thank you.